Hey everyone, welcome to A Mighty Blaze. I am your host, Jane Roll, to have you here today. Here on A Mighty Blaze is Zeitgeist. I talk with authors whose books touch on subjects like race, class, gender, culture, science, all kinds of hot button topics. And we broadcast the first and third Thursdays of the month, usually. And you can find out about what's coming up both on the Zeitgeist and all the other Mighty Blaze shows by following A Mighty Blaze on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I think we may be on TikTok. I don't know because I'm not. Or you can go to our website at mightyblaze.com and sign up for our newsletter. And we'd love to see you on this show and all the others that we've got. I think every day of the week we've got a show. My guest today is Neema Avashia, coming to us live from Boston.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Neema was born and raised in the Kanawha, I'm pronouncing that right?
Kanawha, yeah.
Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, to Indian immigrant parents who moved to Appalachia in the early 1970s so that her father could work in the chemical industry. Much of her writing pertains to the unique experience as growing up as a member of a tight-knit Indian community in a state where they comprise less than half a percentage point of the overall population. Neema writes opinion pieces and commentary regarding her experience as a civics teacher in the Boston Public Schools, which she has done for the last 16 years. Her work has appeared in The Bitter Southerner, Catapult, the Kenyon Review Online, Cognoscenti, and elsewhere. She is the recipient of the 2022 Follow Your Art Foundation Trust Writing Fellowship. And Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, is her first book, essay collection. Welcome. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. So Another Appalachia. I love this title. I think it's great because it speaks to so much of what you write about here. So maybe you can start by telling us what you mean by Another Appalachia.
For sure. First, you should know that was not my original title for this.
Okay.
I am a petty person and I wanted to call this book A Hindu Hillbilly Elegy. Clap back
great
at another book. But my very wise publisher was like, that's not a good idea. We should not do that. Divide the book on its own terms. Yeah. So then we had to figure out a new title, which is not easy when you've had a title in your head for like 5 years.
And it's titled one of the essays, right?
It is. Yeah. Two essays. I worked it in a couple times.
Yeah.
But as we were then trying to figure out, okay, what is the title of this essay collection? I think the word another became really important because part of the point of this book is not to say like, this is a definitive book about Appalachia. I don't actually believe there's a definitive book about Appalachia.
Right.
What I'm trying to do in this book is to lift up that there are many different Appalachian stories. And my family story is one of them. And so I think the goal of saying Another Appalachia is to actually kind of push people to think about what is the mainstream narrative you've heard about Appalachia. When you think about the word Appalachian, who comes to your mind, right? And chances are that who comes to your mind is not the people who are on the cover of my book.
Right. It's white people. It's probably very poor white people. And and that sort of narrative has even changed more, I think, or that perception has changed even more in recent years. I don't know, a lot of like in the sort of divisiveness of our culture right now when people these stereotypes.
Yeah. And Netflix doesn't help. And the New York Times doesn't help. Like, I think there are a lot of, highly funded sources that have sort of invested a lot in perpetuating this narrative and are very interested in continuing to have that be the way we see the region. And so I think the goal of the Another, that word, is just to push a reader's brain a little bit and say, you've heard one story, like this is another one. It's not the only one.
Right.
There is no only one, but this is another one. And if this is another one, there are also many other Anothers, right? There are many Appalachian writers who are queer and Black and Latinx and like all range of identities. So once you start down this road, what I'm hoping is going to happen is you're going to start to read those other writers too.
Yeah.
And start to keep building out your understanding of like the range of identities that exist in Appalachia.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. Now, backing up a little bit, I touched on the fact that your family came to that region for your father's work, right? And it seems like there were other Indian families also came for that same industry, right?
Yeah, 100%. So kind of an important piece of immigration history that some people know, some people might not, is that in 1965, the Congress passed legislation called the Hart-Celler Act, which changed the rules around immigration in the United States. Prior to that point, immigration had basically been based on quotas. countries got a quota about the number of immigrants from that country who were allowed into the United States. And those quotas were pretty racialized. So if you looked at them, they definitely prioritized immigrants from nations that were predominantly white. And Asia and Africa in particular were not highly represented in those quotas. 1965, the Hart-Celler Act changes immigration rules to say, actually, what we're going to prioritize is highly skilled immigrants. So less important what country they come from, more important that if they're coming here, they bring a set of skills and knowledge that we need in the United States right now. That's when you see a really big migration from Asia, from India and the Philippines and China in particular, folks coming over to work in industries where there was a need. And so that was the medical industry in some cases, and it was also in the chemical industry and the manufacturing industry in terms of engineering jobs. So you see a lot of high skilled workers coming over who have been educated as doctors or engineers. But when they come to the United States, the kind of caveat is you got to go work where American people aren't going to work. So a lot of American folks did not want to work in rural areas. A lot of them didn't want to work in deeply urban areas. They wanted to work kind of in affluent and suburban communities. So you found Asian American folks going to work either in the heart of cities or in rural areas. And so that's where my dad and about 100 other Indian families who ended up in the Kanawha Valley kind of were all drawn there because they went to work in rural America. That's where the engineering and healthcare jobs were. So that's where they went.
Right. And so there was some sense of community among the Indian families that were there. But at the same time, you were very much a part of the non-Indian, the white community, predominantly white. And what I thought was so fascinating about your work in these essays was that oftentimes you strove for belonging within both of these communities, right? So there were times when you felt like, well, I don't quite fit in over here with my, white classmates or the friend with the long blonde hair and blue eyes. But at the same time, sometimes you didn't feel like you fit in within your own family and your own culture, like the Indian culture, with maybe the way you wanted to dress or the way you felt or the way you believed certain things. Can you talk a little bit about some of that betwixt and betweenness?
Yeah, I think that as I've gotten older and I think even having access to a term like intersectionality has been so helpful because I think a little bit of what I've realized is inevitably when you have an identity that sits at a bunch of different intersections, what seems to happen is when you're in the space where that identity isn't represented, that's the one that seems to surface the most.
Right.
It's like the thing that's not present is the thing that you become most aware of. And I think that's kind of a little bit of what was happening to me as a kid, but I didn't have words for it. Right. So it's like when I was in these contexts that were majority white, race was the thing that was surfacing for me. When I was in the context where it was majority Indian people, gender identity and sexuality were the things that were surfacing most for me. And so that feeling of being on the outside kept happening because I couldn't find a space where all the parts of me were represented. I could only find spaces where a part of me was represented, but another part of me was I can't see myself here. And so I think that's a lot of what, when I was growing up, I didn't have language for. In the 80s in West Virginia, there were queer visibility was not a thing.
Right.
So I think for a lot of my growing up, I attributed all of that feeling to race because that was the thing I could see. And that was the thing I knew was happening, was that I was minoritized in my school community. But now as an adult looking back, I can be like, oh no, it wasn't just race. It was both things. Both things were happening at the same time. I just didn't have language for them.
Right. Yeah. And when you don't have the language, you can't make the meaning necessarily. I mean, it's funny how that happens, right? You need the language
you need the models to be like, oh, that's what that was.
Right. So now that you're living in the Boston area, right, which is much more diverse, racially speaking, and in terms of gender and sexuality, there's that openness. Do you feel like there's a greater sense of fusion in your identity? Sorry, that's a big, serious question.
Well, that's okay. Yeah and no, right? I think what's most interesting now is that the part of my identity where I feel like that, I don't feel like people are seeing it, is the Appalachian part of my identity. So it's my partner and I don't share the same race. Most of our friends are in interracial relationships. We have lots of friends who are queer. Like, I can find myself in many ways in the context of my social relationships. I can't find myself in the context of being raised in a very different part of the country when it comes to geography. And where culturally the norms are quite different than they are here. And so in a way, I think it has taken living away and being here to actually be able to see again, like, like all these things about how I am and how I move in the world that are so different from New England, or actually because of where I was raised. And they're this Appalachian part of my identity that, again, I don't find here. And not finding it is what's allowing me to sort of name its existence.
Right. It's clearer to you. It's more defined. You write a lot about the idea of nostalgia, right? And this longing for not just place, but a time or a feeling. You shared that Welsh word. What's that? What is it? Hiraeth. Okay. Yeah, I loved that because it was like trying to replicate a sensation, but you don't really know how or what it is. But what was fascinating was you faced a lot of, bigotry and a lot of, rejection in a way when you were home, when you were during your upbringing. But now there's a real, you love it also. There's a real sense of longing for it. And that must be a strange thing. I mean, and you explore it so well in these essays, but it must be an interesting sort of dichotomy to be built. Like, I love that place and I love that time, but it was also really, really hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when I look back, the ratio, right? Like, those really intense and painful moments existed, and it wasn't like they were infrequent.
Right.
But the ratio of those moments relative to the moments of like really deep love, like, it's just not even a competition, right? And so like there is a way in which the love just like outweighs pain. I think that at the same time, like, being an adult and looking at what's happening in Appalachia right now when it comes to policy, it's also an interesting thing to see a place that you love so much adopt policies that enact harm on your body or on your identity, like, and to be like, well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to be from a place where I feel like really deep love for this place and people there? And also legislation is being passed every session that, like, oh, queer people can't foster children. Oh, now we're going to make these rights more difficult. Now we're going to take away these rights. I think in a way, the present day of experiencing that definitely there's a chemical reaction between that and the nostalgia that I feel like I'm still trying to figure out. But like, there is some way in which like seeing that lived reality erodes. It makes me question or interrogate like my understanding of like, did I really feel the things I felt? Were they real, or is there something to trick myself?
Well, and you bring that to life through one of your pieces about Mr. B. And I love that piece because you made that exact story personal. Here's someone who loved me, but then I'm seeing what can you just sum up that essay? Because I think it's just so great.
Yeah, it's an essay. It's called The Blue-Red Divide, and it is about basically a person who was like my adopted grandfather in every way, shape, and form. My grandparents were 8,000 miles away. I didn't know those relationships the way people whose grandparents live here might know them. And, this was a person who was like a real carrying figure for me in my life, and has come to believe things that are very different from what I believe as an adult, and has come to express those things very visibly, in particular in the context of social media. And so in that essay, I think I'm trying to figure out what it means to like continue to hold people with love, even as our beliefs have gone so far away from one another.
Right.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that question in the essay.
No, but it's, and you got to wonder, I have someone in my life who's a little like that, who's, in the times when I used to see this person in person, they were just so loving and embracing. And one of our kids is queer, and like, he was never, he always, there was never any animosity. There was never any prejudice, at least visible. But then seeing an online presence is very different. And I often wondered, we didn't have the kind of relationship where I could then go and say, So you realize like what you're posting is like directly attacking and targeting like our child, and a child and supposedly love. Like, and I often wonder like what would someone like that say? But we don't necessarily have the chance, and it could be a really difficult, like frightening and disappointing experience too.
Yeah. I think it's so hard because I think there are just no rules around social media space. Like we don't,
Right.
we have not learned rules, and so we find ourselves behaving in ways in those spaces that just don't actually often align with like who we are as humans in the world.
Right.
But like, and also I think because of that, don't realize how our behaviors in that space can impact our real lived relationships with people.
Right.
And it's very messy space, and I think it's pretty uncharted. Like I think the thing that's interesting about that essay is I can't tell you the number of people who've said the same thing that you just said, which is like, I know that person, like I have that relationship, and like I also don't know what to do. I think it is something we are grappling with as a nation right now. Like, what is our social discourse when it comes online? And then like, how does that relate to actually how we orient towards each other as full human beings in the world?
Yeah. And I think like you said, there's no sort of standard, right? So some people just will share whatever comes across, their feed, and they're not even really thinking about it or analyzing it carefully. You're just like, oh yeah, that was just a joke, or yeah, I just whatever. I thought they didn't. People don't always give it the measure of thought.
That's right.
People are interacting in that space in very different ways.
Yeah, and not seeing each other, right? I think that's what's so interesting about that is like if I'm looking at you and talking to you, it's a lot harder for me to say those things.
Right.
When you're not actually physically present, it doesn't seem to land on people the same way. It's like, oh, I just shared that thing. I didn't see you. I wasn't thinking about you. Not realizing that doesn't mean it doesn't land.
Right.
The impact is still there, whether you realize it or not.
It seems like such a basic thing. It's just bizarre to me that people, I don't know, as a writer, I guess we're always thinking about our audiences as writers. So it's like, I don't know, I can't help but think like there's a human being on the other side reading this, but I think that's probably not the case for a lot of people.
No, I think that's right. That question of like, how's this going to land is a question I think about. That's my question all the time.
Like, of course.
That preoccupies my brain.
Yeah.
All times when I'm writing is, how's this going to land? I don't know how this is going to land. But I realize more and more that's not a question that every person is thinking about when they like hit post.
No, they're just talking. They're not thinking about who's listening.
Right.
So one of the other things that you touch on is the faith, right, and religion. And growing up, you were, in a Hindu family, but in the Bible Belt. So there were ways that your family was able to sort of practice their tradition, but at the same time, you had folks trying to save you, right? So
indeed, I have been saved. When I was like 5 years old, I went to church and I didn't know what I was doing. So I guess I'm safe in that.
Yeah, you're saved. You're saved. Good.
Knock it off. I'm good.
Yeah, right. Insurance policy.
Just in case it's covered.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, go ahead and ask your question.
Oh no, I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about the ways that your family and the other Indian families around there were able to still practice their traditions, and like what were some of the obstacles there.
I mean, I think I have so much respect for my parents' generation in trying to like carry forward traditions in a context where like there was no infrastructure for supporting them, right? Like they were building all of the infrastructure. The first temple that we had in my community was actually in someone's house. They they converted their basement into a Hindu temple, and then like we would all go there. Right. Or like it would be like, oh, we're going to rent out the middle school gym to do our rituals. It was literally people trying to figure out how can we create the space for doing the things we need to do, because the space doesn't exist. Right. So even just the like mental labor of figuring out like, what does it look like to build the infrastructure around this? How do we even find the places to gather? How do we get the things we need to practice these rituals? There was so much work going into that. And it was really kind of incredible to think about. And I think the strange byproduct, not the intended byproduct, but the kind of strange thing that happened because of it is that I think for a lot of the people of my generation, what ended up happening is the thing that we feel closest to isn't actually faith, but it's community.
Yeah.
So it was the labor that we felt drawn to, right? It was like our parents' labor and the ways in which they were working to create space for us. That was the thing that made us feel most proximate to them and to our culture. So like as an adult, you know, like there's a Hindu temple in Ashland. I've been there once. You know, or like there are Navratri Garbhas that happen in the suburbs all around Boston. And I've gone to them. But I don't feel connected when I go to them because I don't know the people there.
Right.
What I've realized is that the thing that makes faith powerful to me is the community around it.
Yeah.
When you take away that community, like I don't know how to engage with faith outside of that community. I haven't been able to figure that out for myself.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, I think it's like the thing that was the most important part was the community. I don't think that's what our parents intended. I think they were hoping that by building that community, we would carry our faith forward.
Right.
I haven't succeeded in doing that, unfortunately.
I think it's very common, though. I mean, people really, especially, you know, as a child, you build a connection around a certain faith community and a certain, you know, a congregation, if you will. And it used to be when people stayed close to home and didn't go off to other places when they grew up, they would stay within that community. So it's easier to stay within the faith. I think it's a lot harder, like travel somewhere and find that new faith community. I think it's, you know, so there's something about our more, you know, the movement in the way people live and grow up these days that changes it. One of the, I keep saying one of my favorite essays when I'm like, they're all my favorite essays, but one of my other favorites, but there was one called Our Armor that I thought was great because it spoke to that tension of wanting to be proud about, you know, culture and heritage, but also wanting to blend in and assimilate and the tensions between this. And maybe you could, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how your feelings about when your mother used to dress traditionally, right? She would wear the sari, and that was hard for you when you were young.
Yeah, I think that as a kid, particularly growing up in a space where like in my school context, like there were very few Indian students at all, right? I think that I very quickly started to identify like blending in with safety. And like the more that we looked like other people and the more we spoke like other people, maybe that would keep us safer. Because I was very the first time I experienced racism, like I was 6, you know, like I quickly was learning that I was different and that different wasn't a good thing. Different was a danger. And so I think that a lot of my early meaning making around my mom was like, Mom, you're making yourself different all the time. And you making yourself different is making us not safe.
Right.
And so I think because of that, I was asking her to like make herself smaller and make herself less visible. Because in my child brain, like I thought that was going to keep us safer. I think as an adult, I'm like, it didn't matter what we did. We weren't going to be safe no matter what. I shouldn't have done that to my mom.
Right.
Hindsight is 20/20 always. But I do think that was the driver for me a lot. And then my mom, because she was an adult and because she was in more professional environments, like she wasn't experiencing that in the same way. I also think when you come over as like a fully formed adult, it's a different thing than when you're a child in the middle of identity formation, right? Like, even if people were saying things to her, she had armor already built up. Like it was, she was able to handle it and be like, this is who I am. You can take me or leave me, but I'm not going to change who I am. Whereas as a child, I think I didn't know that. Like I didn't have the confidence to believe that I could be who I was and that safety wasn't contingent on that.
Right.
And I think it's only in getting older that I've sort of realized like that, there's no safety. Like safety is not, it actually doesn't exist when you have brown skin in this country. It's never safe. And so you can make the choice to like put your head down and try to be small and think that's going to keep you safe. But the reality is it doesn't.
It's not going to. Right.
And so then you might as well like live your loudest, most visible life because if the options are make yourself small and not be safe or make yourself large and not be safe.
Right.
Be your whole self.
Yeah, be yourself, right? Yeah, I mean, and it was heartbreaking to read about, but not surprising that after 9/11, your family felt the need, and your dad in particular, to sort of loudly proclaim, like, "We love America,"
Right.
the flags everywhere.
Yeah, there's a show on Hulu called Rami, which is amazing. It's about an Egyptian American family, and in that show, there's an episode that's like an episode about 9/11,
Yeah.
and in his dad does the same thing that my dad did, and I
Mhm.
remember watching that episode and being like, oh, like this wasn't just my dad. This
Right.
was like a collective moment for brown
Yeah.
people in America
Yep.
who were like, we're not safe anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And in a way, I think that for Asian Americans in particular, there are some awarenesses around systemic racism that have been harder to come to.
Mhm.
Not having a really deep understanding of American history and not having that sort of like long spanning experience with systemic racism. For my parents' generation, I think it took them longer to learn.
Interesting. It was sort of like, "Wait, what is this? We weren't aware of this."
Right. And we were positioned as a model minority, right?
Right.
In effect, like our introduction into this country was actually to like again put white and black folks on separate sides and be like, well, here's this middle group and we're going
Yeah.
to use them to like keep this oppressive system in place. And I
Right.
don't think that my parents' generation totally understood their role
Mm,
and the
mhm.
role that they were being put in there. I think they
Yeah.
bought it. Not wholesale, but I think a lot of people bought it. I think they bought the
Right.
narrative. I think they bought into to the idea that like you work hard in America and you're going to succeed. Look at us, we're succeeding. If you're not succeeding, it must be because you're not working hard.
Must be right, right. Yeah.
And I think it was 9/11 that made the response to 9/11, which
Yeah.
was like mass surveillance and detention and like
Mhm.
violence that made people realize, oh, us working hard doesn't matter.
It
Like
doesn't matter. Right, right.
it's
Because
not
all
the thing.
people see and yeah, what they see on the outside and
That's right. Yeah. And I
yeah,
remember, like, I talk about in the essay, there was a gas station owner in Arizona named Balbir Singh Sodhi who was killed a couple of days after 9/11. And
right.
he had brown skin and he was wearing a turban. And the New York Times had literally ran an article. I remember this article coming out where it like showed you the different turbans of different countries as if to be like, this is the turban that you should think is a terrorist and this is a turban that you should
This
not.
is
And I was like, what are we doing? Like this
yeah, what?
what
Yeah.
like what like that's your response is like
Yeah,
about what turban to be aware of. I mean, like that was the context. That was 2001. That was like
right.
the it was horrible. It was just like, no,
Yeah.
that's not the point of any of this. No
Not
one,
helping. Not
not
helping. Yeah,
helping,
yeah.
not helping. But
Ugh,
I think that was a real turning point for my parents' generation around their
yeah,
understanding of this country and where
right.
we fit in it.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Uh, Semi-related question. Do you prefer to describe your ancestry as South Asian or Indian? Just curious, as I have friends who feel strongly about both. Asks Chris.
That's a great question, Chris. I don't feel the word I actually use to describe myself is desi. And desi
Mhm.
means someone from Desh is like the word for really like broadly India, Pakistan, like the whole
Mm,
area, region, Bangladesh, like that
right.
kind of area of the world is like I would call myself desi.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, that is not a word that I think has a lot of awareness or credence like outside of like our community. So like
Yeah,
people will be like, "Oh, you're South Asian American or you're Indian American or whatever," and I'm like, "You can use all those words, but it's none of
yeah,
them are the word that I
right.
use to identify myself. Desi is the word I use."
Yeah. I've been hearing it more though. I mean, it seems to be picking up steam, so
Oh yeah,
people will understand what it is. Yeah.
we're working on it.
Yeah, there we go. So just I have a couple more questions, but if anyone is watching and has questions or comments they want to throw in the chat, please feel free. And before I forget, also you can find Neema's book at Paper Cuts in JP, Jamaica Plain, for those of you in the Boston area. But of course, you can find it anywhere books are sold. So actually, my question is about the book itself and how it came together. When you were writing these individual essays, which were published different places, did you ever imagine that they would become a book, or were you just kind of going along essay by essay?
I was definitely going along essay by essay.
Mhm.
I really started taking Grub Street classes
Oh, cool.
intentionally and like seriously in about 2015.
Hmm.
More like as a like I'm a middle school teacher. I have no time to write. I have to figure out how to build some structure myself.
Yeah.
And so Grub Street really provided structure and systems and community and deadlines and all these things I needed.
Right.
And I started writing essays for those classes as assignments,
Mm-hmm.
not knowing where I was going, right? But then really, really quickly, people in my workshops started to be like, we're seeing themes and we're starting to draw connections, or like, we want to know more here.
Yeah.
And it almost took like other people saying that a lot of
Yeah.
time for me to be like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm working towards something.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely didn't start with that intent. I started just to be like, I had this really weird experience of growing up Indian in Appalachia. No one believes it's a thing. I'm going to start writing some stories to try to show people that it was indeed a thing.
Right.
And we'll see where it goes. And so that, like, that was where I started. Like, really, my audience was in some ways myself. And it
Right.
wasn't only over the course of like several workshops and several conversations and revisions that it started to be like, nope, this isn't just a story for me. Like, there's more that's happening here that we're going to try to put together into a book.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you end up altering or editing the essays once you were working on putting them into a book?
I did. I definitely. So I submitted for consideration for publication in like the summer of 2020. And so then once West Virginia University Press accepted the book, I changed some of the endings to reflect more of the pandemic context.
Right.
So there are definitely some endings or parts of essays that are updated or changed to reflect kind of a changing world.
Yes. Isn't that crazy how just so many things you wouldn't have expected need to be addressed when you go back and look at the post-pandemic reality. Yeah. I have a scene in my book, which is coming out, which I had written well before the pandemic, that's about like this messaging, this conferencing software where people are in little boxes and like it goes through this. I mean, not that didn't exist before the pandemic, but but it goes through this whole explanation. And like when I went back to it, I'm like, oh my God, everyone knows what Zoom is now. Like, I don't need to explain this thing.
Delete the paragraph and just write.
Exactly. Like, conferencing. Anyway, yeah. So I'm curious, has your family read the book, or have they read your work all along? Has that led to some interesting conversations?
Different folks in my family engage with my work in different ways. My sister is 7 years older than I am, and she's like always my champion. She's super supportive. She always went first and kind of like then buffered me afterwards. So he's read everything along the way all the time. My mom's read the book, and I think my mom has been like really supportive in reading it and just said, we raised you to be a really honest person, and this is a really honest book. And it's really balanced, and you've done a really good job of holding all the different pieces. And so I feel like that's a kind of grace that I really appreciate.
Yeah.
And I'm also really aware that like culturally what I'm doing is not common.
Right.
Is not common to tell the truth and to put it in writing and to publish it for other people to read. Like, each of those steps is like moving pretty far away from traditional cultural norms. So
Right.
I think that means that, there are definitely people in my family who have a harder time
Yeah.
with the idea. And I get that. I think we come at it from different places. For me, I think that growing up without mirrors made it a lot harder for me to figure out who I was. And it took me a lot longer, and it hurt a lot more to not have mirrors.
Yeah.
And so there are ways in which, for me, like, writing this book is about making a mirror. And that mirror is not for my family. Like, that mirror is for readers who my family doesn't necessarily know, but there are queer kids in Appalachia right now, and there are brown queer kids all over the United States who like need mirrors.
Right.
And need to see how other people grapple and like how they make meaning and how they navigate, and need those books. And so there's a way in which I think I am choosing those young people.
Yeah.
And choosing the idea that they need those mirrors over sort of silence, and saying, like, this is my experience, but I'm not going to share it.
Right.
I feel like that sharing, it's really important, I think, for young people to know, like, you're not alone in this, and like other people are doing this, and they're making a mess as they go, and like you can maybe learn from their mess, and maybe that helps you to have a little bit of an easier road.
Yeah. Oh, I love that image of it being a mirror, and what a great way to put it. Because people say a lot, we read to know that we're not alone, but this kind of takes it a step further. It really speaks to this idea of seeing yourself reflected in someone else's experience, and and knowing and being able to see yourself, right? To be seen. And that's really powerful. So
yeah, it's not my word. It is Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop is an amazing, amazing professor of children's literature who has talked about the idea that books can be mirrors, windows, or sliding doors. And that's, you need all of those things, you know.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I gotta check that
She's
out.
amazing. So it's her language, but it is very helpful, I think, in thinking about the role that books can play for young people.
Wonderful. Yeah. Now, this book isn't specifically geared at young people, though certainly young people would get a lot of, I can imagine, you know, I'm going to toss this over to my teenagers. But do you think you'll do any writing in the future that's more clearly aimed at young folks?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think that because I'm a teacher, like there is a way in which I write that is pretty accessible to young people. I think
For
just
sure.
because like that's how I communicate, like that's how I've learned to communicate. I've been a teacher since I was 23, so I don't really have a voice that's not my teaching voice. Like is my teaching voice.
Right.
And so in a way, I think the thing I think about more than like writing a book that's specifically YA is what does it mean to write stories in a way that young people can access them and adults can access them, and we can be talking about the same text. Because I think there's actually some real power in it being like, you read this book and now your kids read this book, and like you're in that same conversation around it.
Right.
And I've had some really lovely experiences with young people who have read it, who have been able to sort of like engage and access it and not felt like, oh, this is not a book for me.
Right.
And so I think that's more like the space I like to live in, is like, this is a book that can kind of exist for multiple audiences, but I'm going to make it so that it can exist for multiple audiences.
Yeah. No, and it absolutely does. It's very accessible. It is right in the zone where I think you could absolutely, you know, teenagers could relate to it and see themselves in it, obviously, for sure. So wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone. This is the book, Another Appalachia. Grab it while it's hot. I think it's like been in multiple printings now, so you know, get your hands on it. And yeah, for yourself, for your kids, for whoever. Thank you so much, Neema, and best of luck with all future endeavors and the rest of your tour, virtual and otherwise.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on today. I really appreciate it.